Welcome back to Unseen Anthology, where we uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows of seemingly ordinary lives. Today, we dive into a case that will make you question the very foundations of what we call family. This is the macabre history of the Follings, a couple who adopted 12 children over the span of 15 years, none of whom had birth certificates. What began as a heartwarming story of generosity quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to Unseen Anthology and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly descent into the darkest corners of human history. Now, let's begin. The small town of Willowbrook, nestled in the gentle folds of rural New England, was hardly the kind of place where you'd expect to find a story so disturbing that it would eventually attract the attention of federal investigators. With a population of just under 2,800 people, Willowbrook was the sort of place where everyone knew everyone, where the annual harvest fair and Friday night football games were the highlights of the social calendar, and where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone fell ill. It was in this seemingly idyllic setting that Henry and Lillian Folling made their home in the spring of 1979. The Folling residence was a sprawling Victorian house on Maple Lane, set back from the road and partially hidden by a stand of ancient elms. The house had been vacant for nearly a decade before the Follings purchased it, and the locals had begun to call it the haunted house on the hill. But Henry Folling, a successful accountant from Boston, saw potential in the dilapidated structure. He and his wife Lillian, a former pediatric nurse, spent a small fortune renovating the property, transforming it from a crumbling eyesore into the envy of the neighborhood. They seemed like such a lovely couple, recalls Martha Evans, who lived across the street from the Follings for nearly 20 years. Henry was always impeccably dressed, even when he was just checking the mail. And Lillian, well, she had this way about her, so poised, so elegant. They were the kind of people you'd want to invite to dinner. You know, the kind of people who made you feel important just by talking to you. But beneath the veneer of respectability, the Follings harbored secrets that would eventually shock the entire community. According to public records, Henry and Lillian were unable to have biological children of their own. This was a source of great sorrow for Lillian, who had always dreamed of having a large family. She used to watch the neighborhood children playing from her porch, says Evans. There was something so sad about it. The way she'd just sit there for hours watching them laugh and run around. I remember thinking at the time that she would have made a wonderful mother. And indeed, it seemed that Lillian would finally get her chance at motherhood when, in the summer of 1981, the Follings announced that they had adopted a baby boy, whom they named Samuel. The community was thrilled for them. Neighbors organized a surprise baby shower, and the local church held a special blessing ceremony for the new family. Samuel Folling was a beautiful child, bright-eyed and quick to smile, and the Follings doted on him obsessively. Lillian wouldn't let anyone else hold him, remembers Clara Jenkins, who attended the same church as the Follings, not even at his blessing ceremony. When the pastor asked to hold him for the blessing, she got this look on her face like a cornered animal. Henry had to whisper something to her before she'd hand him over, and even then, she stood so close to Pastor Williams that she was practically breathing down his neck. In retrospect, this possessiveness might have been the first red flag, but at the time it was easily dismissed as the natural protectiveness of a new mother, especially one who had waited so long to have a child. Within 2 years of settling into their newly restored home, the Follings announced the adoption of a second child, a girl they named Abigail. The news was met with the same warmth and celebration as their first adoption, and the community of Willowbrook seemed eager to embrace the growing family. The Follings house, once a symbol of neglect and decay, now echoed with the laughter of children at least. That was how it appeared from the outside in rapid succession. More children followed. By 1985, the Follings had 5 adopted children, all under the age of 7. The speed with which they were able to adopt was unusual. especially given the typically lengthy and bureaucratic process in Massachusetts at that time. But Henry Folling was well connected, and Lillian's reputation as a former nurse lent the couple an air of trustworthiness. They were seen as saviors, recalls Detective Michael Grant, who would later lead the investigation into the Folling family. Here was this respectable couple, taking in children who might otherwise have grown up in the system. Who was going to question that? Who would want to? But there were oddities that, in hindsight, should have raised concerns. None of the Folling children attended public school. Lillian insisted on homeschooling them, citing a desire to provide a nurturing and individualized education. The children were rarely seen in town, and when they were, they never strayed far from their parents' sides. They didn't participate in sports or other extracurricular activities, and they had no friends outside the family. I remember trying to arrange a playdate for my daughter with Abigail Folling, says longtime Willowbrook resident Patricia Hayes. They were about the same age, and Abigail seemed so lonely. But Lillian always had an excuse. Abigail was ill, or she had too much schoolwork, or they were planning a family trip. After a while, I stopped asking. The isolation of the Folling children might have continued indefinitely if not for an accident that occurred in the summer of 1987. 7-year-old Daniel Folling fell from a tree in the family's backyard and broke his arm. Lillian, despite her background as a nurse, didn't take him to the hospital. Instead, she attempted to set the bone herself, resulting in a compound fracture that became infected. It was only when Daniel developed a dangerously high fever that Henry finally overruled his wife and took the boy to the emergency room. Dr. Sarah Chen was the attending physician at Willowbrook General Hospital when Daniel was brought in. The child was in septic shock by the time he arrived. We had to perform emergency surgery to save his arm, Dr. Chen recalls, and even then, there was significant nerve damage. What struck me most, though, was the boy's reaction. He didn't cry, not once during the entire ordeal, and when I asked him how he'd broken his arm, he looked at his father before answering. It was as if he was waiting for permission to speak. Dr. Chen's concerns deepened when she asked for Daniel's medical records and was told that they didn't exist. According to Henry Folling, all of the children's records had been lost in a fire at their previous adoption agency. When Dr. Chen pressed for more information, Henry became agitated and threatened to transfer Daniel to another hospital. That's when I knew something was wrong, says Dr. Chen, but I had no proof, only suspicions. And in a town like Willowbrook, suspicions about a family like the Follings could damage your career. Nevertheless, Dr. Chen filed a report with Child Protective Services expressing her concerns about potential medical neglect. A caseworker named David Morris was assigned to investigate. Morris visited the Folling home, interviewed the parents, and observed the children. His report, filed 3 weeks later, concluded that there was no evidence of abuse or neglect. The children appeared healthy and well cared for, Maurice wrote. The home environment is clean and safe. Mrs. Folling explained that she initially tried to treat Daniel's injury herself due to her medical background and a fear of hospitals, stemming from her own childhood experiences. While this decision was ill-advised, it does not constitute willful neglect. The case was closed, and life in Willowbrook returned to normal. The Follings continued to expand their family, adopting 3 more children between 1988 and 1990, Robert, Anna, and Henry Jr. By now, some in the community were beginning to whisper about the unusual family on Maple Lane. How were they able to adopt so many children so quickly? Why were the children so rarely seen in public? And why did they all share the same vacant expression, as if something vital had been drained from them? I used to watch them at church, says Martha Evans. 8 children, all sitting in a perfect row, not fidgeting, not whispering, not doing any of the things that normal children do during a long service. They just sat there staring straight ahead. It was unnatural. But if the community had questions, they kept them largely to themselves. The Follings were generous donors to local causes, and Henry sat on the boards of several influential charities. They were, by all outward appearances, model citizens. Then, in the winter of 1992, a new family moved to Willowbrook. Michael and Susan Fletcher, along with their teenage daughter Emily, took up residence in a modest house just a few doors down from the Follings. Michael was a journalist who had recently accepted a position with the Willowbrook Gazette, and Susan was a social worker with experience in child welfare cases. Mom noticed something off about the Folling kids right away, says Emily Fletcher, now in her 40s. She had worked with traumatized children before, and she recognized the signs. The way they flinched at sudden movements, how they never made eye contact. The fact that they always seemed to be watching Lillian out of the corners of their eyes, as if they were afraid of missing a cue. Susan Fletcher began to make notes of her observations, documenting patterns of behavior that concerned her. She also tried to befriend Lillian, hoping to get a closer look at the family dynamics. Lillian was initially receptive, perhaps seeing in Susan a potential ally in a community that was increasingly curious about her unusual family. The two women began to meet for coffee, and occasionally Susan would be invited to the Folling home. It was during one of these visits that Susan noticed something strange. Emily recalls, "She told me about a room on the 3rd floor. The door was always locked, but she could hear sounds coming from inside, shuffling, and sometimes crying. When she asked Lillian about it, Lillian said it was just storage, and that the house made strange noises because it was old. But Mom didn't believe her." Susan's concerns grew when, in the spring of 1993, she spotted a child she didn't recognize peering from a 3rd-floor window of the Folling house. The child, a girl with long dark hair, vanished from sight as soon as Susan looked up. When Susan mentioned this to Lillian, Lillian laughed it off, saying it must have been Anna or Abigail. But Susan had met all of the Folling children by that point, and she was certain this was someone new. Around the same time Michael Fletcher was working on a series of articles about adoption fraud for the Gazette. His research had led him to discover that several adoption agencies in Massachusetts and neighboring states had been shut down in the 1980s for illegally placing children without proper documentation. Dad never specifically connected this to the Follings in his articles, says Emily, but I remember him telling Mom that the timeline matched up with when the Follings were adopting their first batch of kids, whether by coincidence or design. It was shortly after Michael's articles were published that the Follings announced they were adopting again. This time, a set of twins named Peter and Paul, followed by a girl named Mary, bringing their total to 11 children. And once again, the adoptions happened with surprising speed. Looking back, it's clear that they were taking advantage of loopholes in the system, says Detective Grant. They would work with different agencies, often in different states. They would provide documentation from previous adoptions to establish themselves as experienced adoptive parents, and they would specifically request children from difficult backgrounds, children who were less likely to have complete records. Children who might slip through the cracks. But why? What possible motive could the Follings have for adopting so many children? According to those who knew them best, Lillian's desire for a large family seemed genuine. She had transformed herself into the maternal figure she had always wanted to be. Henry, though less overtly enthusiastic about parenthood, appeared to indulge his wife's wishes without complaint. It wasn't about money, Detective Grant insists. The Follings were already wealthy. They didn't need adoption subsidies, which were minimal in those days anyway. And it wasn't about appearances. If anything, having such a large family made them stand out in ways they might have preferred to avoid. The truth, when it finally began to emerge, was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. In the fall of 1994, Susan Fletcher was diagnosed with breast cancer. Her illness progressed rapidly, and by the spring of 1995, she was confined to her home receiving hospice care. It was during this time, as she faced her own mortality, that she decided to share her suspicions about the Follings with someone who might be able to act on them. She called me to her bedside one night, remembers Detective Grant, who was then a junior officer with the Willowbrook Police Department. She had this file, pages and pages of notes she'd been keeping on the Folling family observation. Inconsistencies in the stories Lillian had told her. Photographs she'd taken of the house, including that third-floor window where she'd seen the unknown child. She made me promise that I would look into it after she was gone. Susan Fletcher died on June 12, 1995. Grant kept his promise, though initially he proceeded with caution. The Follings were powerful in Willowbrook, and accusations against them would not be taken lightly. Grant began by reviewing public records related to the family property deeds, tax filings, and what little information was available about the adoptions. Most of the adoption records were sealed, Grant explains, but I was able to confirm that the Follings had worked with at least 5 different adoption agencies across 3 states. And I found something else interesting. Each time they adopted, they made a substantial donation to the agency involved. Not illegal necessarily, but definitely unusual. Grant also discovered that Henry Folling had established a trust fund for each of his adopted children. On the surface, this appeared to be a loving gesture, ensuring that the children would be financially secure as adults. But the terms of these trusts were strange. The money would only be accessible when the child reached the age of 25, and only if they met certain conditions, including maintaining regular contact with their adoptive parents and not seeking information about their biological origins. It was about control, Grant says. Everything the Follings did was about control. Armed with this information, Grant decided to take a more direct approach. He began driving by the Folling house regularly, noting who came and went. He interviewed neighbors, teachers who had briefly interacted with the Folling children during mandatory standardized testing, and former employees of the household. The staff never lasted long, Grant notes. They'd worked for the Follings for a few months, maybe a year at most, and then they'd suddenly leave town. No notice, no forwarding address. It was like they vanished. One former housekeeper, Maria Vasquez, had left Willowbrook in 1991 after working for the Follings for just 6 months. Grant tracked her down to a small town in Vermont, where she was living under her maiden name. Initially, Vasquez refused to speak about her former employers. But when Grant showed her the file Susan Fletcher had compiled, something changed in her demeanor. She started crying, Grant recalls. She said, "So someone else knows, someone else has seen." And then she started talking. And once she started, she couldn't stop, according to Vasquez. The Folling children were subjected to a strict regimen designed to break their spirits and ensure their compliance. They were forced to follow elaborate rules that changed constantly, making it impossible to avoid punishment. They were isolated from each other, with each child assigned a separate bedroom and forbidden from entering the other's rooms. They were required to address Henry and Lillian as Sir and Madam, never as Mom and Dad. But the worst thing, Grant says, was what Maria told me about the 3rd floor. She said there were 3 rooms up there that were always kept locked. She was responsible for leaving food outside these rooms 3 times a day, but she was never allowed to see who was inside. She could hear them, though, children's voices, sometimes crying, sometimes singing to themselves. When she asked Lillian about it, Lillian told her that these were children with special needs who required isolation for their own safety. Vasquez had finally left after witnessing Lillian punishing Samuel, who was then about 11, for speaking during dinner without being spoken to first. The punishment had involved forcing the boy to stand in a corner all night, with Lillian checking on him hourly to ensure he hadn't moved. Maria said she couldn't be part of it anymore. Grant says she packed her things that night and left before dawn. She was afraid not just of losing her job, but of what the Follings might do if they knew she disapproved. With Vasquez's testimony and Susan Fletcher's notes, Detective Grant felt he had enough to justify a more formal investigation. He took his findings to his superior, Chief Raymond Wallace, expecting support. Instead, he was told to drop the matter. The chief said there wasn't enough evidence to warrant an investigation into such a respected family. He reminded me that Henry Folling was friends with the mayor, the district attorney, and half the town council, Grant recalls. He suggested that I was letting my friendship with the Fletchers cloud my judgment. Frustrated but undeterred, Grant continued his investigation unofficially, working on his own time and keeping his notes at home rather than at the station. He was particularly interested in the identities of the children allegedly being kept on the third-floor children who were not among the 11 officially adopted by the Follings. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Emily Fletcher, then 19, and studying journalism like her father, had not forgotten her mother's concerns about the Folling family. She had been conducting her own research, focusing on missing children cases from the regions where the Follings had adopted. I found a pattern, Emily says. In at least 3 instances, when the Follings adopted a child from a particular area, there was a report of another child going missing from the same area within a month. These were always children from vulnerable populations, foster kids, children of migrant workers, children from families dealing with addiction or poverty, children who might not be missed right away, or whose disappearances might not generate much attention. Emily shared her findings with Grant, who used his law enforcement access to dig deeper. He discovered that in each case Emily had identified, the missing child had never been found, and in each case, the investigation had been cursory at best. It was like these kids didn't matter to the system, Grant says bitterly. Like, they were disposable. Armed with this new information, Grant decided to bypass Chief Wallace and take his case directly to the Massachusetts State Police. He compiled a detailed report, including Vasquez's testimony, Susan Fletcher's notes, Emily's research, and his own findings. He sent it to a contact at the state level, a former colleague named Lisa Harper, who now worked with a task force on crimes against children. Harper took the report seriously. Within a week, she had secured a warrant to search the Folling residence, but obtaining the warrant was only the first hurdle. The execution of that warrant would prove to be one of the most challenging operations of Grant's career. We knew we had to move quickly and decisively, Grant explains. If the Follings had any warning, they might destroy evidence, or worse, harm the children. But we also knew that they had connections. If word of the impending search reached them through official channels, the whole operation could be compromised. Harper assembled a team of state troopers and agents from the newly formed Child Exploitation and Obscenity section of the Department of Justice. Grant was included as a local liaison. The plan was to execute the warrant at dawn, when the household would likely be asleep and at its most vulnerable. On the morning of October 23, 1995, a convoy of unmarked vehicles approached the Folling estate. The officers moved swiftly, securing the perimeter before announcing their presence. Henry Folling, dressed in a silk bathrobe, answered the door. According to Grant, he showed no surprise at the sight of law enforcement on his doorstep. He was expecting us, Grant says. Somehow he knew we were coming. He invited us in, as if we were guests, arriving for a dinner party. He was completely calm, completely in control. Lillian Folling was a different story. When she realized what was happening, she became hysterical, screaming that they had no right to invade her home, that they were traumatizing her children. She had to be restrained when she physically attacked one of the female officers. The search of the house began methodically, with teams assigned to different areas. The 11 known Folling children were found in their bedrooms, all awake despite the early hour, all dressed and sitting on the edges of their beds, as if awaiting inspection. They didn't react to our presence, Harper would later report, not with fear, not with curiosity, not with anything. It was as if they had been emptied out. The officers attempted to interview the children, but they were met with scripted responses, that revealed nothing. Even Samuel, who was by then 17 and legally able to speak for himself, would only say, "Sir and Madam provide everything we need. We are happy here." The true horror was discovered on the 3rd floor. As Maria Vasquez had testified, there were 3 locked rooms. When the officers broke down the doors, they found 3 children, a girl of about 10 and 2 boys who appeared to be around 8. Unlike the Folling children downstairs, these children reacted with terror to the presence of strangers. They cowered in corners, hiding their faces and whimpering. The conditions were deplorable, Grant says, his voice tight with anger, even decades later. The rooms were bare except for mattresses on the floor. There were no toys, no books, nothing to suggest that these were children's rooms. The windows were covered with blackout curtains nailed to the frames, and the smell was overwhelming. These children had been living in their own filth. Medical examinations would later reveal that all 3 children were severely malnourished and showed signs of physical abuse. None of them could speak English fluently, suggesting that they had been taken from non-English speaking households, and none of them appeared in any official record. No birth certificates, no adoption papers, nothing to indicate that they legally existed. They were ghosts, Grant says, children who had been erased from the world. The discovery of these hidden children transformed what had been a case of suspected child abuse into something far more sinister. The FBI was called in, and the investigation expanded to include potential charges of kidnapping, human trafficking, and falsification of federal documents. Henry and Lillian Folling were arrested on the spot. As they were being led away, Lillian broke free from the officer holding her and ran to the staircase, screaming something in a language that none of the officers recognized. Later analysis would suggest it was a form of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, a practice associated with certain religious traditions, but also sometimes observed in individuals experiencing extreme psychological stress. That was when I first began to wonder if there was a religious component to what the Follings were doing, Grant says. Up until that point, I had assumed it was about control, about Lillian's twisted desire for a large family that she could shape however she wanted. But that moment on the staircase, it hinted at something deeper, something ritualistic. As the investigation progressed, this suspicion would be confirmed in ways that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. With the Follings in custody, the focus shifted to understanding the full scope of their crimes and, more urgently, identifying and helping their victims. The 3 children found on the 3rd floor were placed in emergency foster care, while the 11 officially adopted children were temporarily housed in a group home designed for traumatized youth. Interviewing the children proved challenging. The 11 adopted children maintained their scripted responses, refusing to deviate from what they had clearly been taught to say. The 3 hidden children, meanwhile, were too traumatized to communicate effectively. They flinched at any sudden movement, refused to make eye contact, and became hysterical when separated from each other. It was as if they only trusted each other, says Dr. Evelyn Marrow, a child psychologist who worked with the children, which made sense given what they had endured. They had been kept in isolation, their only human contact being with each other and periodically with Lillian, who would visit them to administer what she called treatments. These treatments, as described by the children once they began to communicate through art therapy, involved Lillian forcing them to drink a bitter liquid that made them sleepy, after which she would recite what sounded like prayers or incantations over them. Sometimes she would draw symbols on their bodies with a dark liquid that might have been ink or blood. The ritual aspect was undeniable, Dr. Moreau says, but we couldn't identify any known religious tradition that matched what the children described. It seemed to be something Lillian had created, a personal mythology that she was imposing on these vulnerable children. While Dr. Moreau worked with the children, Grant and the federal agents searched the Folling house for evidence. In Henry's study, they discovered a hidden safe containing multiple sets of falsified adoption papers, as well as large sums of cash in various currencies. But the most disturbing find was a leather-bound journal written in Lillian's hand. The journal, which spanned nearly 20 years, detailed Lillian's mission to create what she called the perfect family. According to her writings, she believed that children were born with sins that needed to be purged before they could become truly pure. The purging process involved breaking the child's connection to their birth family, stripping away their original identity, and reshaping them according to Lillian's vision. She saw herself as a savior, Grant says. In her mind, Lillian wasn't abusing these children, she was saving them. She was cleansing them of their past and giving them a new, purified existence as members of her family. The journal also revealed that Lillian classified the children into two categories: the redeemable and the vessels. The redeemable were the 11 officially adopted children whom Lillian believed could be purified through strict discipline and religious indoctrination. The vessels, the 3 children found on the 3rd floor, as well as others who had come before them, served a different purpose, according to Lillian's writings. The vessels were children whose souls were already too corrupted to be saved. Instead, they were to be used as receptacles for the sins that were being purged from the redeemable children. It was a twisted form of transference. Lillian believed she could extract the evil from one child and place it into another. This explained the treatments described by the hidden children. Lillian was performing rituals designed to transfer what she perceived as sin or evil from her adopted children to these unfortunate vessels. And once a vessel was full estate, Lillian claimed to be able to identify by looking into their eyes, they would be discarded. The journal did not explicitly state what happened to these discarded vessels, but it did reference a resting place on the Folling property where the filled ones sleep until Judgment Day. This led to the most gruesome phase of the investigation, the search of the Folling estate's grounds. In a wooded area at the far edge of the property, cadaver dogs alerted to a patch of earth that appeared undisturbed to the human eye. Excavation revealed the remains of 5 children buried in shallow graves marked only with small stones. The medical examiner estimated that the oldest burial was about 14 years old, which would place it around 1981, shortly after the Follings adopted Samuel. The most recent was probably less than a year old. All of the children had died from similar causes, a combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure. They had essentially been neglected to death. Forensic anthropologists worked to identify the remains, a process complicated by the lack of dental records or DNA samples for comparison. Eventually, 3 of the 5 children were tentatively identified as matching the descriptions of children reported missing from areas where the Follings had adopted. Maria Gomez, age 9, reported missing from a migrant worker camp in central Massachusetts in 1981. Tyrell Washington, age 7, who disappeared from a Boston housing project in 1985, and Alexei Petro, age 8, the son of Russian immigrants who vanished from his front yard in Worcester in 1990. The other 2 children remained unidentified, referred to in official records only as Jane Doe No. 1 and John Doe No. 3. That's the thing that still haunts me, Grant says. Those 2 kids, someone must have loved them. Someone must have missed them, but they died without names, and they were buried without ceremony. It's as if they never existed at all. As the evidence mounted, the case against the seemed irrefutable, but the legal proceedings would prove to be as twisted and complex as the crimes themselves. Henry Folling hired a team of high-powered defense attorneys who immediately began working to distance him from his wife's actions. They painted a picture of Henry as an unwitting participant, a man so consumed by his financial dealings that he was oblivious to what was happening in his own home. They pointed out that Henry was frequently away on business, sometimes for weeks at a time, and that Lillian had been the primary caregiver for all of the children. It was a transparent strategy, says Assistant U.S. Attorney Meredith Lane, who prosecuted the case. Henry wanted to save himself by sacrificing his wife, but the evidence didn't support his claim of ignorance. He had signed all of the fraudulent adoption papers. He had established the trust funds with their controlling conditions. He had built the locked rooms on the 3rd floor. He might not have performed the rituals, but he had enabled them at every turn. Lillian, meanwhile, was deemed incompetent to stand trial after a psychological evaluation revealed severe delusional disorder with religious preoccupation. She was committed to a secure psychiatric facility, where she remained until her death in 2008. Denied the opportunity to shift all blame to his wife, Henry Folling changed tactics. His attorneys began negotiating a plea deal, offering Henry's cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Specifically, they promised that Henry could provide information about other children who had been vessels, but whose remains had not been found on the property. It was a gut-wrenching decision, Lane admits. On one hand, we wanted Henry to face the harshest possible penalties for his crimes. On the other hand, the possibility of bringing closure to more families, of giving names to more lost children, that was hard to ignore. In the end, a deal was struck. Henry pleaded guilty to multiple counts of child endangerment, kidnapping, and falsification of federal documents. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony, he received a sentence of 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Henry's information led investigators to 3 additional burial sites, each on properties that the Follings had owned briefly before selling a lake house in upstate New York, a hunting cabin in rural Vermont, and a beach house on the Maine shore. In total, the remains of 8 more children were recovered, bringing the total to 13 victims. 13 vessels for 12 redeemable children, Grant notes. In Lillian's twisted logic, there had to be more vessels than redeemable children because some of the vessels would become filled more quickly than others. It was all part of her sick arithmetic of salvation. Of these additional 8 victims, 5 were eventually identified: Lucia Diaz, age 9, Kwame Johnson, age 7, Tran Nguyen, age 10, Sarah Blackfeather, age 8, and Dmitry Kowalski, age 6. All had been reported missing between 1983 and 1992, and all came from marginalized communities, where law enforcement resources were stretched thin and missing children cases often went uninvestigated. The Follings were predators, Lane says. They deliberately targeted children who wouldn't be missed or whose disappearances wouldn't generate headlines. They exploited the same systemic failures that they used to adopt their redeemable children without proper scrutiny. As for those 12 redeemable children, their fates were varied and in many cases tragic. Samuel, the oldest, committed suicide in 1998, 3 years after the Follings were arrested. Abigail developed severe anorexia and has been in and out of treatment facilities for most of her adult life. Daniel, whose broken arm had first brought attention to the family, disappeared after turning 18 and has never been found. Some of the younger children were eventually adopted by new families, while others remained in the foster care system until they aged out. The damage was too deep, says Dr. Moreau. These children had been systematically brainwashed from a very young age. They had been taught that their worth was tied to their purity, and that purity could only be achieved through suffering. It's not something you can undo with a few years of therapy. The 3 children found on the 3rd floor, later identified as Sofia Herrera, age 10, Mateo Herrera, age 8, and Carlos Herrera, age 8, were eventually reunited with their family. They had been taken from a rural area near Springfield, where their parents were migrant workers. The parents had reported their children missing, but the local police had suggested that the family had simply moved on, as migrant families often did. It was a miracle that they were found alive, Grant says. If we had waited even a few more months, well, based on Lillian's journal, Sophia was already being described as nearly filled. She would have been the next to be discarded. Henry Folling died in prison in 2011, having served 16 years of his sentence. He never expressed remorse for his actions, maintaining until the end that he had only been trying to help his wife realize her dream of a large family. His estate, valued at several $million, was divided among the surviving victims as part of a civil settlement. The Folling house on Maple Lane was demolished in 1997, and the land was converted into a community garden dedicated to the memory of the children who had died there. Each year on the anniversary of the Follings' arrest, the people of Willowbrook gather in the garden for a vigil, lighting 13 lanterns for the 13 vessels and 12 candles for the 12 redeemable children, whose lives were forever altered by Henry and Lillian Folling. It's not enough, Grant says. Nothing could ever be enough to make up for what those children suffered, but it's something. It's a way of saying, we remember, we acknowledge what happened here, and we're sorry we didn't see it sooner. The case of the Follings has had lasting impacts on adoption laws and procedures in Massachusetts and beyond. The Folling Act, passed by the state legislature in 1998, requires more rigorous background checks for adoptive parents, limits the number of children that can be adopted by a single family within a specific time frame, and mandates regular home visits by social workers for the first 5 years after an adoption. The system failed these children, Lane says. We all failed them. The neighbors who noticed something off but didn't speak up. The doctors who saw the signs of abuse but didn't push harder for answers. The officials who were too impressed by Henry's wealth and status to ask the hard questions. Even law enforcement. We should have taken Susan Fletcher's concerns more seriously from the beginning. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Folling case is the knowledge that there might be more victims who will never be found. Henry's cooperation was limited to the children buried on properties directly linked to the Follings. But given the family's extensive travels and Henry's business dealings across multiple states, it's possible, even likely, that there were other vessels whose remains are still undiscovered. I've made peace with the fact that we'll never know the full extent of the Follings' crimes, Grant says. But I haven't made peace with the fact that there are parents out there who still don't know what happened to their children. That's why I keep going back to the case files, even in retirement. That's why I still follow up on every lead, no matter how unlikely, because those children deserve to have their names. They deserve to have their stories told. And so, the macabre history of the Follings continues to unfold, even decades after their crimes were first discovered. It serves as a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a facade of respectability, of the vulnerable children who slip through the cracks of our society, and of the terrible consequences when those entrusted with their care betray that sacred responsibility. Before we end today's episode, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the families of the identified victims. Maria Gomez, Tyrell Washington, Alexia Petro, Lucia Diaz, Kwame Johnson, Tran Nguyen, Sarah Blackfeather, and Dmitry Kowalski. Their lives were cut short by unimaginable cruelty. But in telling their stories, we ensure that they are not forgotten. And for Jane Doe number 1, John Doe number 3, and the 3 remaining unidentified children, we may not know your names, but we bear witness to your suffering. You matter. You have always mattered. The Folling case is now studied by law enforcement officers, social workers, psychologists, and religious scholars. It serves as a case study in how abuse can be hidden behind wealth and status, how destructive belief systems can develop and flourish in isolation, and how the most vulnerable members of society, children, can fall through the cracks of the systems designed to protect them. If there's any silver lining to this terrible story, Grant says, it's that it has made us more vigilant. It has changed laws and procedures. It has made us more willing to ask difficult questions and to follow up when the answers don't seem quite right. It has reminded us that we all have a responsibility to protect children, not just the ones in our own families, but all children. And perhaps that is the legacy of the Folling case. Not just a tale of horror and depravity, but a call to action. a reminder that the darkest deeds often happen in the places we least expect, and that our willingness to see, to speak, and to act can make the difference between life and death for those who cannot protect themselves. In the community garden that now stands where the falling house once loomed, 25 trees have been planted, 12 oaks for the redeemable children, 13 willows for the vessels. Each year they grow taller and stronger, their branches reaching toward the sky in silent testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring hope that from even the darkest soil, new life can emerge. The story of the Follings did not end with the closing of court files or the planting of trees. In the years since the case first shocked Willowbrook and the nation, numerous theories have emerged about the origins of Lillian's disturbing belief system. While the official investigation focused primarily on identifying victims and building a legal case against the Follings, researchers and true crime enthusiasts have continued to probe the psychological and potentially cultural roots of Lillian's rituals. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, a professor of religious studies at the University of Massachusetts, has spent years examining Lillian's journal and court testimonies. What's particularly interesting about Lillian's belief system is that it doesn't neatly align with any established religious tradition, Montgomery explains. It contains elements that might seem familiar: the concept of sin, the idea of purification through suffering, ritualistic cleansing, but they're combined in ways that are entirely idiosyncratic. According to Montgomery, Lillian's background might offer some clues. Born Lillian Phelps in 1947, she was raised in a small farming community in rural Vermont. Her parents were described by neighbors as deeply religious but private people, who rarely attended community events and kept their children home from school whenever possible. There were rumors in the town about unusual religious practices in the Phelps household. Montgomery says nothing specific, nothing that anyone could prove, but enough to make the family something of an enigma. The few people still living who remember the Phelps family described them as odd and secretive. At 18, Lillian left home to attend nursing school in Boston, a move that apparently caused a permanent rift with her family. According to school records, she never returned home for holidays, and none of her family attended her graduation. By all accounts, she was a dedicated student who specialized in pediatric care, drawn to working with children from the beginning of her career. There's a gap in our understanding of Lillian's life between her graduation from nursing school in 1968 and her marriage to Henry in 1979, Montgomery notes. We know she worked at several hospitals across New England, never staying in one place for more than a year or two. And we know that she spent some time in Europe in the early 1970s, though the exact purpose of this trip remains unclear. It was during this European sojourn that Lillian might have encountered the obscure religious texts that later influenced her beliefs. Among her possessions seized during the investigation was a collection of manuscripts, some dating back to the 17th century, that dealt with various esoteric traditions. These included works on alchemy, Gnosticism, and certain mystical practices that involve the concept of spiritual transference, the idea that qualities like sin or virtue could be moved from one vessel to another. These weren't mainstream religious texts, Montgomery emphasizes. They were obscure, often fragmentary works that would have been difficult for a casual reader to find. Lillian must have sought them out deliberately, suggesting a pre-existing interest in these concepts. By the time Lillian met Henry Folling at a charity gala in Boston in 1978, she had developed the framework of her belief system, a system she apparently kept hidden from her husband-to-be, at least initially. Henry, by all accounts, was not a religious man. His interest was in accumulating wealth and social status, goals he pursued with single-minded determination. It's an open question whether Henry ever fully understood or shared Lillian's beliefs, says Grant. In his testimony, Henry claimed that he thought her interest in adoption stemmed from a genuine desire to help underprivileged children, combined with her inability to have biological children. He said, He only became aware of the religious aspect gradually, and by then he was too deeply involved to extricate himself. But Grant remained skeptical of this claim. Henry was an intelligent, observant man. The idea that he could live in that house for 15 years and not know what was happening stretches credulity to the breaking point. Dr. Montgomery offers another perspective. I think Henry might have seen Lillian's beliefs as a form of eccentricity, something to be humored rather than challenged. There's evidence that he was genuinely in love with her, at least in the beginning, and people in love often overlook or rationalize behaviors that would alarm an outside observer. Whatever Henry's level of understanding or complicity, there's no doubt that he enabled Lillian's actions through his financial resources and social connections. Without Henry's money to facilitate quick adoptions and buy properties where vessels could be hidden or buried, without his status to deflect suspicion and intimidate potential whistleblowers, Lillian's mission might have been discovered much sooner. They were a perfect storm, Grant says grimly. Lillian with her twisted vision, Henry with his means to make it reality, and caught in the middle were 25 children whose lives were destroyed. The 25 children Grant refers to include the 12 redeemable children who were officially adopted and subjected to years of psychological and sometimes physical abuse, and the 13 vessels who suffered even more extreme neglect before ultimately being killed when Lillian deemed them filled with the sins she believed she had extracted from her adopted children. Of the 12 adopted children, only 9 are still alive today, in addition to Samuel's suicide and Daniel's disappearance. Abigail died of a drug overdose in 2007 at the age of 28. The surviving 9 have largely avoided public attention, changing their names and attempting to build lives away from the shadow of their traumatic childhoods. Mary, now in her 40s, is the only one who has spoken publicly about her experiences. In a rare interview given to a documentary filmmaker in 2015, she described the constant fear that permeated the Folling household. "We were always afraid of disappointing them," she said. "Sir and Madam, that's what we had to call them. Had these elaborate rules that changed all the time. You never knew what might trigger a punishment. Something that was acceptable one day could be forbidden the next. It kept us constantly on edge, constantly vigilant." Mary also spoke about the cleansing rituals that Lillian performed on the children. "She would make us drink this tea that tasted horrible, and then she'd make us kneel in this circle she'd drawn on the floor. She'd recite these long passages in a language none of us understood, and she'd touch our foreheads with this cold, wet finger. Sometimes she'd make cuts on our arms, small ones, nothing that would leave obvious scars, and collect the blood in a little silver cup." According to Mary, the children were told that these rituals were necessary to remove the badness they had brought with them from their previous lives. Madam said, "We were born with sin inside us, like a disease," Mary recalled. She said our birth parents had infected us, and only she could cure us if we resisted the treatments. She said the sin would grow until it consumed us, and then we'd have to go live upstairs with the bad children. The bad children Lillian's vessels were occasionally shown to the adopted children as a warning. She'd take us up there one at a time and make us look at them through this little window in the door, Mary said. They were always so thin, so dirty, and their eyes, they looked dead already, you know, like there was nothing inside them anymore. Madam would say, "This is what happens to children who don't accept the treatment. This is what happens when the sin takes over." This psychological torture, combined with physical deprivation and isolation, created an environment of complete control. The children were entirely dependent on Lillian and Henry for everything: food, shelter, human contact, and the definition of reality itself. It was a classic cult dynamic, says Dr. Moreau. The leader defines what is true and false, good and evil. The followers are cut off from any outside influence that might contradict this definition, and over time, the followers internalize the leader's worldview to such an extent that they can no longer distinguish between their own thoughts and the thoughts that have been implanted. This explains why, even after being removed from the Folling home, many of the children continued to defend their adoptive parents and to insist that they had been happy there. It wasn't Stockholm Syndrome in the classical sense, Dr. Moreau clarifies. It was more fundamental than that. These children had never known any other reality. They had no framework for understanding that what had happened to them was abuse. The process of healing for these children was slow and painful. Some, like Samuel, never managed to overcome the trauma. Others, like Mary, have spent their lives in a cycle of progress and relapse, forever struggling with the psychological wounds inflicted during their formative years. The tragedy of the Folling case isn't just the 13 children who died, Dr. Moreau says. It's also the 12 who lived, but were never allowed to develop into the people they might have been. Their potential was stolen from them just as surely as the lives of the vessels were stolen. In the years since the Folling case, researchers have identified similar patterns in other cases of extreme child abuse, particularly those with religious or cult-like elements. The combination of isolation, ritualistic behavior, and the exploitation of children's natural dependency creates conditions in which almost unimaginable cruelty can flourish. What makes the Folling case unique, says Dr. Montgomery, is the scale and duration of the abuse, as well as the way it was hidden in plain sight. This wasn't a compound in the wilderness or a closed religious community. This was a respected family in a typical American town. The Follings went to church on Sundays. They attended community events. Henry served on local boards. They were, to all outward appearances, pillars of the community. This facade of normalcy allowed the Follings to operate for nearly 2 decades without serious scrutiny, and when concerns were raised by Dr. Chen after Daniel's injury, by Susan Fletcher after her observations of the family, they were too easily dismissed by those with the power to intervene. That's the lesson we should take from this case, Grant insists. Not just the spectacular horror of what happened inside that house, but the ordinary failures that allowed it to continue. The neighbor who saw something odd but didn't want to seem nosy. The official who accepted a flimsy explanation because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. The colleague who noticed something wrong but didn't want to risk their career by speaking up. These everyday failures of courage and responsibility, multiplied across a community and spanning years, created the conditions in which the Folling's crimes could flourish, and according to Grant, similar dynamics continue to enable child abuse today. The names and circumstances change, but the pattern remains the same. Someone notices something wrong, but they tell themselves it's not their business. Or they report it, but they don't follow up when nothing seems to happen. Or the system gets involved, but it's too overworked and underfunded to provide the kind of sustained attention that might reveal the truth. This systemic failure is particularly pronounced when it comes to children from marginalized communities, the very children the Follings targeted as their vessels. Children from poor families, immigrant children, children of color, children in the foster care system all are statistically more likely to be victims of abuse and less likely to receive thorough protection from that abuse. The Folling case isn't ancient history, Grant says. It's a warning about what can happen when we fail to protect our most vulnerable children, and it's a reminder that sometimes the monster isn't hiding under the bed or in the closet. Sometimes the monster is the respected neighbor down the street, the one everyone thinks is such a pillar of the community. As for Lillian Folling, she spent the last 13 years of her life in a secure psychiatric facility, never legally tried for her crimes due to her ongoing mental incompetence. According to staff reports, she continued to perform her rituals in private, using whatever materials she could find or fashion. She maintained until her death that she had been doing God's work, saving children's souls through a sacred process of transference. In one of her final journal entries, written just months before her death from cancer in 2008, Lillian wrote, "They think they've stopped the mission, but they don't understand. The work continues on another plane. The vessels are filled, the redeemable are cleansed, and when judgment comes, all will see that I was right. All will know that I was chosen for this holy purpose. Henry, meanwhile, spent his years in prison writing a memoir titled Blind Trust, in which he portrayed himself as a victim of Lillian's manipulation. The manuscript was never published, as the courts ruled that Henry could not profit from his crimes, but copies have circulated among researchers and true crime enthusiasts, providing insight into the mind of a man who enabled unspeakable cruelty while maintaining his own innocence. I loved my wife, Henry wrote in the manuscript's conclusion. I believed in her goodness, her kindness, her desire to help children in need. By the time I realized the depth of her delusion, I was trapped by my love for her, by my fear of losing everything we had built together, and by my own complicity in what had already occurred. I am not blameless, but I am not the monster they have made me out to be. I am simply a man who loved unwisely and too well. Detective Grant, who has read the manuscript, dismisses Henry's self-portrayal. It's self-serving nonsense, he says. Henry wasn't some love-struck victim. He was an active participant in the abuse and exploitation of 25 children. He may not have shared Lillian's religious fervor, but he was willing to benefit from it, from the adoration of a community that saw them as saviors, from the control they exerted over their victims, from the sick dynamic they created together. Regardless of Henry's motivations or level of belief, the consequences of his actions and his failures to act were the same. Children suffered and died, lives were destroyed, and a community was left to grapple with the knowledge that such darkness had existed in their midst, unrecognized and unchallenged for far too long. Today, the Folling case is studied by law enforcement officers, social workers, psychologists, and religious scholars. It serves as a case study in how abuse can be hidden behind wealth and status, how destructive belief systems can develop and flourish in isolation, and how the most vulnerable members of society, children, can fall through the cracks of the systems designed to protect them. If there's any silver lining to this terrible story, Grant says, it's that it has made us more vigilant. It has changed laws and procedures. It has made us more willing to ask difficult questions and to follow up when the answers don't seem quite right. It has reminded us that we all have a responsibility to protect children, not just the ones in our own families, but all children. And perhaps that is the legacy of the Folling case. Not just a tale of horror and depravity, but a call to action. A reminder that the darkest deeds often happen in the places we least expect, and that our willingness to see, to speak, and to act can make the difference between life and death for those who cannot protect themselves. In the community garden that now stands where the Folling house once loomed, 25 trees have been planted, 12 oaks for the redeemable children, 13 willows for the vessels. Each year they grow taller and stronger, their branches reaching toward the sky in silent testimony to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring hope that from even the darkest soil, new life can emerge. And so we end our exploration of the macabre history of the Follings. A story of horror, yes, but also a story of courage. The courage of Susan Fletcher, who first raised the alarm. The courage of Maria Vasquez, who fled the house of horrors, but didn't forget what she had seen. The courage of Detective Grant, who persisted in his investigation despite official resistance. And most of all, the courage of the children who survived Mary, and the others who continue to live their lives day by day, carrying burdens no child should ever have to bear. May we honor their courage with our vigilance. May we ensure that such horrors never again hide in plain sight behind respectability and wealth, and the reluctance to ask uncomfortable questions. And may we never forget the names of those who didn't survive: Maria, Tyrell, Alexia, Lucia, Kwame, Tran, Sarah, Dimitri, and the 5 children whose names we may never know, but whose lives mattered just the same. This has been Unseen Anthology. Till next time, remember that the darkest truths are often hidden in the stories we hesitate to share. Thank you for joining us, and may you never stop seeking the light.